How do the algorithms that we're surrounded with shape our lives? Why does a journalist begin to write differently once metrics are introduced? What is algorithmic capture? Has clickbait always existed? What did that look like before the internet? How could even vegan content creators go in for rage bait? What does any of this have to do with why someone would insist on cooking pasta in the bathtub, or the 19th century actress Sarah Bernhardt, or one weird trick, or Oxford English Dictionary's Word of the Year? Join me today with sociologist Angele Cristin as we talk about how algorithms invisibly sculpt human behavior. Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and an author at Stanford. And in these episodes, we sail deeply into our 3-pound universe to understand why and how our lives look the way they do. Every brain is trying to navigate itself through a very social world, and it's always unconsciously making predictions to figure things out, like what should I pay attention to, or what is worth my time? What should I care about? And for essentially the entirety of human history, those signals came from other humans. You read a lot of information from the expressions on their faces, like a raised eyebrow. You hear things in the tone of people's voices. You modify your behavior if you are getting signals of approval or disapproval, not just from your parents, but more generally from your tribe. Our brains have worked with these sorts of signals for millions of years. You're looking for a nod of approval, or people laugh at what you say, or they scowl at it, or whatever. But now, imagine replacing all that with numbers. Now you've got a dashboard and a counter that ticks upward, and you've got a graph that rises or falls, and it's all in real time. And you have a notification that says 3,400 people watched this, or 12 people watched this. So all of a sudden, in this past nanosecond of human evolution, we are suddenly in an era when the signals that guide our behavior are not primarily human faces, but instead metrics. You've got numbers and rankings, you've got dashboards, and it's based on algorithms that you can't really see. And these algorithms decide what appears in front of us and what disappears. And here's the wild part. When those signals change, we change. Often unconsciously, writers will change what they write based on the feedback. Creators will change what they're about based on the feedback. Sometimes there are subtle ways this happens, like someone tweaks a headline, or they make a video shorter, or they spend more time thinking about a stronger hook. But pretty quickly, entire professions can reorganize themselves around these invisible feedback systems. So what happens now that algorithms are the primary environment that we're swimming in? What happens to professional values? What happens to identity? Just think about one example of this. One of the brand new words that we all witnessed the birth of a couple decades ago was clickbait. As you presumably know, this is one of those provocative headlines like, "You'll never believe what happens next." And this gets you to go down some rabbit hole that you didn't intend to go down. But now, clickbait has evolved into Oxford English Dictionary's Word of the Year last year, which is rage bait. This is the next evolutionary step in the attention economy. Rage bait is all about shouting something, some statement that's so inflammatory or so absurd that your nervous system lights up before your more thoughtful neural networks even get their shoes on. So you feel a surge of whatever, anger or disgust or disbelief, and before you're consciously aware of it, your fingers are clicking and you're commenting, you're sharing, you're stitching a video, you're firing back at someone in the comment section. Now you're all worked up. But from the algorithm's point of view, engagement is engagement. And in a system that measures success by interaction, provoking emotion is a very effective strategy. So I'm fascinated with what all this means for us as a society. And I knew there was no one better to call for this than Angele Cristin. Angele is a sociologist who has spent years embedded inside newsrooms, inside influencer culture, inside the worlds where algorithms and analytics shape what people produce and how they see themselves. Angele studies incentives and how our digital infrastructures are reshaping the social fabric around us. So I'm so pleased to sit down with her today to talk about what happens when human brains live inside algorithmic systems and how those systems are shaping our behavior. So, Angele, you study algorithms and their social impact on people. Tell us about that.
For the past 10 years, I've been looking at how algorithmic technologies are playing an increasingly important role in people's lives and in their work. So now the thing is, I'm a sociologist by training, so I really care about people's identities, their work practices, how they communicate and relate to others. And all of that has been completely transformed with digital technologies and the computational procedure sustaining them. Everything we do now is mediated through computational procedures one way or another, thanks to mobile devices on the one hand and computers on the other.
So let's take a specific example. So you got interested some years ago in how journalists were writing their articles and what kind of things they chose to write and how that changed once these algorithmic metrics got introduced. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that was so interesting. At first, I came to kind of study journalism because I was like, with the internet and kind of online advertising, the business models of the news are changing, right? In big part because online advertising moved to social media platforms and Google. And so news websites had less money and newspapers had less money. And so I was kind of broadly interested in that and like, what does that mean for the future of the news? And I did what I always do. I'm an ethnographer, which means that I go spend time with people. I interview them, I have lunch with them, I observe how they work, I become kind of part of the furniture at the office. It's like, oh yeah, she's here again, just observing us another day. And what I realized at that point is that in the different newsrooms that I was studying, some of them were in New York, some of them were in Paris, journalists kept on looking at these specific software programs that they were kind of obsessed with. And so what were these software programs? They were web analytics software programs that were providing detailed real-time data about what readers were doing on the websites, right? So it was giving kind of social media metrics, like how many readers were coming from Facebook, from Twitter, etc. It was telling people how many people had read the articles they had published, right? Was it 10 people, 20 people, 100, 1,000, 100,000, a million, right? So giving that, it was ranking all the articles in terms of their popularity on the website and on social media. And it was also telling journalists how long readers were spending on average on any given article, which, by the way, is not a good metric in the sense that, like, it's almost always in the range of like 6 to 15 seconds is the average time that readers spend on any news article, right?
Ouch.
Yeah, not fun for journalists, definitely. Yeah. They prefer to ignore that one. And so what I realized is that journalists kept on talking about that. So that was the early 2010s, right? People didn't really know. I mean, the internet was still pretty new, right? And social media was even newer. But journalists were just like, wow, look, like that article is so popular. It's just like, it's, such a hit. Everybody's clicking on it. Whereas this article, disappointing. I spent 2 weeks reporting this and no one's clicking on it. And so they kept on discussing this and making jokes about it, talking about it, and kind of more and more using this data to make sense of what it meant to be a good journalist.
Yeah. So first, What was the difference before? If you were a newspaper writer, let's say 20 years before that, how did you get feedback?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing. So what's really fun there, and that's, the great point of being in academia, is that other people have studied print newsrooms in the 80s and 90s, right? So we have all of this historical material about how print newsrooms used to work. Now, so print newsrooms, the way it used to work was two characteristics. First, journalists and editors did not care much about the audience, right? And they didn't care mostly because they thought that what mattered more was the opinion of their peers and superiors. So there was this kind of strong professional identity that what was really important was what other journalists were thinking about you, both in your newsroom and in other newsrooms, right? Because journalists always try to move between one newsroom and the next. So let's say you're at the New York Times, you also care about what people at the Washington Post think about your work, because if they like it, perhaps they'll offer you a job later on, that kind of stuff. And then what your hierarchical superiors thought of your work. So your editors-in-chief, basically, right? And if your editor-in-chief was saying like, wow, this is a great article, well done, that was it. That was kind of the best things that could happen to you on any given day. Now, they were receiving letters from the audience, right? So letters to the editor are like kind of a long-established tradition. Most newspapers have them. But there are all of these kind of historical studies showing that journalists mostly disregarded these letters. And they are like, oh yeah, people are crazy. They're going to send us crazy stuff. They don't understand how journalism works, right? So a very different kind of relationship where really what the audience was actually doing and what it wanted wasn't very well understood or kind of paid attention to. The second aspect there was also that with newspapers, there were lots of surveys, obviously, because you had marketing departments and you had like kind of the commercial side of publications, right? And they cared about the audience because that's how, depending on, readership figures, that's how they were able to charge for more expensive advertising space, right? And so that's what revenues depended on. So the marketing departments were doing surveys, but what's interesting about these surveys is that, in the 18 and 90s, they only asked like, well, do you like the newspaper? And people would say, yeah. But they didn't have super granular data about, well, which section exactly do you read the most? People would say like, well, based on memory, I tend to read more the lifestyle, say. But, I really care about international news too, right? So people, they were relying on this kind of post hoc memories and recollections of what readers were doing. And they didn't really know in detail which articles and which topics they cared the most about. Now comes the internet and comes web analytics and the kind of software programs and algorithms kind of displaying with dashboards what these analytics look like to journalists and editors. Suddenly, they realize that no one's clicking on international news. Very few people click on political news unless it involves some kind of scandal or sex or celebrities. Right? That people care a lot about lifestyle news. They care a lot about celebrity news. They care not at all about culture and the arts. That's not really what people click on, right? And so suddenly they have this kind of like almost tsunami of data telling them what people are actually clicking on. And that's kind of a cognitive revolution for journalists, right? Because suddenly they're just like, wait, what should we do? Should we only do tabloid news? Because that's what readers want? Or is our job something else?
And, it's interesting because from a behavioral economics perspective, even if you asked readers in a very granular fashion what they wanted and so on, they don't necessarily know that consciously. They might think I'm the kind of person who clicks on international news, even though they don't. Okay, so there's this notion of algorithmic capture, which is that, let's say you're a writer, you start chasing the numbers and you end up doing what the algorithm wants. Now, one might say, okay, but maybe there was something like editorial capture, the editor who's senior to you, who you really admired, you end up doing what he or she wanted. The problem is that the algorithm is more opaque, right? And it changes, it's fungible. So tell us how you see that.
Yeah, so that's fascinating because that's exactly kind of what I observed in newsrooms, and that's what my book, Metrics at Work, Journalism and the Contested Meaning of Algorithms, is basically all about, right? So what I find kind of due to that kind of, again, that wave of granular data that kind of entered newsrooms, and often it entered newsrooms with the best intentions, right? Which was that editors, journalists, and the companies that were usually for-profit companies that were providing these kind of dashboards and software programs were like, listen, it's a question of democratization. We want to give journalists the knowledge of what their audiences are actually engaging with so that they can survive in the digital age, right? So that they can thrive in the digital age. So that was the impulse, a good one. Right? But then what you see is that once that data is available, you get exactly the kind of algorithmic captures that you find, right? And there is this push towards clickbait. It's just it happens at many different levels. Individually, it happens because journalists, like all communicators, and I include academics in that, they want to be read. What's the point of being a journalist if no one reads your stuff? You know what I mean? That's kind of an existential question. And so to me, it makes perfect sense that you would be like, well, I'm going to do everything in my power so that, my articles find their audience, right? And if that means putting a slightly more clickbaity title, so be it.
And clickbaity is things like, here's one weird thing you can do. And so what else do you see?
So at the time, so that's going to be a bit dated now because, again, this was, the bright days of the early 2010s, right? But the big things were, this one weird trick, you'll never believe, what happened next was shocking. Listicles were a big thing, right? Like the 10 best restaurants in San Francisco, kind of stuff. Slideshows too, right? Because at the time, a lot of newsrooms were still counting page views. And so a slideshow with 10 pages counted as 10 page views. I know it's really kind of a cheap trick. So kind of things like that, right? And you could see these formats becoming widely popular across newsrooms because newsrooms were also all watching each other and seeing, especially at the time, it was BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post, using these kind of more clickbaity tactics and getting the traffic numbers that were coming with from it, especially on Facebook and Twitter. And everybody was like, okay, we got to do this, right? So then a couple of things kind of happen. So first one, which is exactly what you said, is that, social media traffic and social media algorithms are fickle. They have gotten only more fickle since, right? But they're opaque. So no one really understands what's getting recommended. And, platforms have given some modicum of information, but they also don't want users to game the system. So they're not giving that much information, right? Then social media platforms also made sudden changes over the years that really hurt newsrooms. For example, Facebook at some point in the mid-2010s decided that it was going to stop prioritizing posts and articles from news organizations and instead promote relatively more organic content, namely content coming from individuals. And that's where influencers started thriving, but that's for a bit later. But so from one day to the next, basically, you had all news websites whose traffic was like that, just going way kind of further down, just because in one change in the Facebook algorithm that cut traffic kind of in half for many newsrooms, right? So it's fickle and things are changing, and what works well as a recipe for traffic at one point stops working, and everybody's kind of in the dark and trying to figure out what happens. So that's kind of the first problem. The second problem is that, journalists were also thinking really hard about, if we follow what the algorithms want, we're only going to do tabloid news, right? Namely, again, sex scandals, celebrities. That people are always going to click more on that, But this is not what our role is. At the end of the day, we became journalists because we care about democracy, holding the state and the powerful accountable, about covering kind of longer stories, more complex stories, right? And so what I kind of observed during kind of all the time I spent in newsrooms is that basically journalists were torn between these different definitions of what their professional identity was about. On the one hand, they were like, well, we're professional communicators, so we want our stuff to be read. And so if clickbait has to happen, we will do it because it's important. We want to reach our audience. But on the other hand, they were also saying, well, we care about sharing important things that will make our readers more enlightened citizens of the world. And so they were kind of always torn between these two kind of definitions and kind of moving back and forth. And what was fascinating is that they would often do like funny little accounting things where they would do like, okay, so I really want to write this article about, say, again, international news, Ukraine, let's say, right? Because I really think it's important and I think our readers need to know about this. But I know that people are not going to click a lot, right? So to make up for it, I'm also going to write an article on, say, Rihanna, right? And that's going to boost my traffic numbers. And that way I've kind of subsidized my Ukraine article with the Rihanna article in terms of traffic. So they would do like all of these little deals with themselves to try to optimize both sets of kind of constraints.
What was the equivalent of clickbait back in the day of newspapers? Because there was, what's it called, yellow journalism? I mean, there must have been ways that people were trying to get readers. And of course, there were tabloid presses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So there were many equivalents. And so that's the thing. Clickbait has always existed in many ways. So at the time, let's see, there was a lot of kind of, as you say, yellow journalism. So extremely outrageous, like inflammatory, kind of aggressive headlines, really kind of emphasizing kind of hatred, right? Or like kind of xenophobia, bigotry, like, things like that have always existed. And many newspapers over the past 2 centuries have really indulged in that because, again, it like stokes kind of patriotic sentiments, for example, and people are like, yeah, like, I'm gonna buy this newspaper. So that's kind of one aspect. Definitely coverage of stars and celebrities. For example, at the time, Sarah Bernhardt, in the late 19th century was like the idol. All kind of teenage women were doing clippings, newspaper clippings of the actress Sarah Bernhardt. That was a thing. And so newspapers would always put lots of pictures of her so that like they knew that teenage girls would do the clippings, so they would force their parents to buy the newspaper so that they could do that. Same with lifestyle and kind of beauty advice. Same things. That's always been very popular. Cooking recipes, things like that. You know what I mean? So it's not new. It's just the shape it takes and the specific tricks that people use to capture the attention changes with the medium. You know what I mean? From print to broadcast to digital. But again, I think it's a change in degree, not really a change in kind, if that makes sense.
So when you published your book in 2020, you were interested in this issue about clickbait and how people were getting sucked into this whirlpool of that. Now, we're in 2026. So last year, Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year was ragebait, which is close cousins to clickbait. So tell us about ragebait.
So ragebait, I think of as a kind of like vengeful cousin of clickbait, right? Where clickbait was still kind of light. You will never believe what happens next. You will be shocked. 10 weird tricks to whatever, do something, Ragebait is more about provoking you into kind of negative kind of arousal, right? Negative emotions such as kind of anger, fear, hatred. Again, not things that are radically new, but really kind of pushing on that. The typical example of rage bait is going to be an influencer or someone on the internet just stating something outrageous, right? Or doing something outrageous, but with complete confidence and innocence and not seeming to see the problem, right?
Yeah.
So there are a number of examples of that. I mean, it was one of the ones that I like are like these weird cooking videos, but where they cook things like, for example, like in the bathroom using the bathtub and doing like, this is really the most efficient way to cook pasta or something like that. And like kind of really going fully in, you know what I mean? And not acknowledging how weird it is to try to cook pasta in a bathtub or whatever it is. Or, you know, so I mean, anyway, there are lots of examples. And what's really interesting about this type of content is that it's typically produced by content creators who know very well that it's going to infuriate people, right? It's going to make them mad. But because it's going to make them mad, they're going to engage with the content. They're going to watch it. They're going to comment on it. They're going to share it, all kind of basically yelling insults, you know what I mean? And saying like, how dare you? How could you? This is so gross. I can't believe. Are you a troll? Why are you saying this? How can you say this? But all of this obviously translates into revenues and engagement on social media platforms. And so that's very much a deliberate kind of content production strategy.
When you think about rage bait, what percentage of that is political versus, I hadn't thought about the cooking pasta in the bathtub.
That's a good question.
When I think about it, I think people saying things politically that are very inflammatory. But you I'm glad to see you have a broader view of rage bait.
I definitely have a broader view. I mean, I think it's a continuum, right? So the way I think about it is that it's really a spectrum from, you know, what psychologists call kind of high arousal negative content, right? So that's going to be anything inflammatory, incendiary, shocking in a negative way, right? Where it just makes you kind of freeze and it kind of bypasses whichever defenses you may have. And you're just like, this is serious and bad. I need to pay attention, right? It's almost like an embodied response, right? That just like shortcuts kind of a lot of the usual ways we have of interacting with media. So that's kind of one way. And then like rage bait, I think it's a bit of a wider kind of type of content because it also involves other kind of emotions, such as like, again, disgust, weirdness, like, you know, a wider set of reactions that are also negative, but are not necessarily about politics specifically.
Yeah. Now, does it make sense for anyone on social media to do clickbait and rage bait? Is it sensible, or are we all sinking into a morass?
This is such an excellent question. So it depends on the time frame you're looking at. And again, to some extent, you know, this is a question that most kind of content creators have to deal with at this point. And it also kind of resembles the questions that newsrooms at the time had to deal with, but in a bit of a different way. So let me walk through that. So for content creators, it depends on how you monetize your online production, right? If you monetize it through platform payments, so things like the YouTube Partner Program, right, where if you qualify, you have to have a channel that's kind of big enough. But if you do qualify, you can get 55% of the advertising revenues that your videos gather, right? So in that case, basically, your revenues are going to depend on how many views you get and watch time, right? Obviously, so that's going to be the main thing. So in that case, rage bait in the short term, amazing, right? Because you're going to provoke people into watching, you hook them in with something truly kind of atrocious, or really kind of hair-raising kind of stuff that like makes it so that like you can't look away. Literally, it's like looking at a car crash. You know what I mean? You kind of have to watch it just to see what's going to happen next and which kind of insane things they're going to be saying next. And then you keep on engaging through comments and sharing, etc., making then the video even more popular because that's what recommendation algorithms are going to pick up on. They're going to look at all of these engagement signals, right? And they're going to promote it more widely, making it go viral. So all of this is great for watch time. All of this is great for platform payments in the short term. Now, the question is, can you make a living for several years based on that type of content? And that's where it becomes a bit more complicated because you see, you can shock people once, you can shock people twice, you can shock people 3 times, but then more likely they're just going to stop watching because they're going to be like, oh, well, that's that person doing their shocking thing again. But, I've wisened up. I'm not going to click. I'm not going to give them that attention. So what I've seen kind of in my world is that often what happens is that over time, influencers or content creators move from only relying on platform payments and views and watch time as a way to kind of really make a living to becoming more either what I call gurus. So trying to really monetize their audience directly through especially donations, subscriptions. And so that entails a slightly different way of relating to the audience and producing content where it's not so much rage bait and kind of this kind of negative, shocking engagement, but it's more framing things as it's us against them. Right? So basically saying, I'm speaking truth to power. I'm saying things like it is. And you are following me because you like that I'm uncensored. You like that I'm saying things the ways they should be said. And so if you want to support my mission, please subscribe to my channel, give me a donation, subscribe to my Patreon, and kind of support me financially. But it's a bit of a different thing than the rage bait. You see what I mean? Because it's more about loyalty at that point.
Yeah. Now, you've spent a lot of time studying influencers or content creators. And am I correct that you see there's a lot of anxiety in that population?
Absolutely. So that was kind of my next project after journalists. And, the thing with journalists is that they themselves could see the writing on the wall. And they were like, oh, we are all going to become influencers, basically. And, it's something that newsrooms have been doing ever since. Basically, they show more and more video content kind of on their homepages, and they send kind of journalists to have more like journalist/influencer profiles in order to try to reach young audiences on TikTok, for example, right? So anyway, so I was just like, oh, so what about content creators? So I spent 6 years studying content creators and doing interviews with them, observing them as they were shooting videos and kind of producing them, doing interviews with brands, with platform employees, and just trying to understand the careers of influencers, right? And like, how do you make money as a content creator? And more importantly, how do you keep on making money over time? Because it's one thing to make money for 1 year. It's another thing to make money and make a living and sustain yourself for 5, 7, 10 years. And so, what I found basically is this big, like one of my first findings is this big disconnect between what people imagine being a content creator is like and what the reality of social media labor looks like. So almost everybody at this point thinks that being a content creator sounds like the most fun job in the world. In a recent survey from 2023, more than 50% of Americans said that they would like to become content creators. So this is a massive kind of pull on the collective imagination, right? We're all like, oh my gosh, they're having so much fun. They get to follow their passions. They get to have an amazing life to talk about what they care about. They kind of look great, right? They're just having so much fun. They're hanging out with their friends. I want to do that. And I want to have the money, the glory, the fame, the luxurious lifestyle that comes with it. And so what you see is more and more people entering into social media creation and trying trying to become an entrepreneur, right? And saying, I want to be my own boss. I want to be a content creator, and I want to follow kind of my passion, talk about the topics I'm truly interested in, and that my day job is not recognizing. Okay, so big pool, a big funnel that kind of brings in lots and lots of people to social media creation. What happens, though, is that it turns out making a living as a content creator is very hard. And why is it very hard? Well, mostly, again, because of social media algorithms and the fact that it's really hard to figure out what people want to watch and what platforms are rewarding in terms of content, right? And what's getting promoted, especially through recommendation algorithms and through feed algorithms that kind of are gonna present you with the most kind of viral and popular videos of the day. And so for content creators, what that means is that very often they're like, oh, well, I'm going to try, right? And so they try, and let's say they get a bit of success at the beginning, right? And they have a couple of videos that go viral. And let's say they start kind of getting some followers. And so that looks pretty good, right? And let's say they have brands that start coming to you and are like, oh, do you want to work with us? Like, we'll send you sunglasses, and eventually a little bit of payment. But soon what happens is that, creators realize that it's a 24/7 kind of job, in the sense of, in order for some of your videos to go viral, in order for your number of subscribers and followers to kind of keep increasing, which is what brands want to see. They want to be associated with accounts that are going up, not with accounts that are going down in terms of audience measurements, right? You have to post videos all the time. Because most of these videos will not go viral. Most of them will not find their audience, right? But you are kind of a production company of one person. And so that means that you have to post every day. And so again, what I see in my interviews is creators saying, I made myself sick. I tried to post every day, twice a day, just to keep that rhythm. I was on my own, in my bedroom, and it just became too much. I just couldn't deal with it. So that's the first thing. It's a relentless rhythm. It's a rhythm that would be very hard for a TV network or like a newsroom to kind of keep doing. And we're talking here about people who are alone. They're like a company of one in their bedroom, right? And just pushing themselves and saying like, I'm an entrepreneur, I have to make it work, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing that happens is that as they get kind of more popular and the size of their following kind of increases, most of them start receiving hate comments, right? And start kind of facing the darker side of the internet. So at first they're like, oh, I love my community. I love my followers. We share the same passion for X topic, right? Regardless of whether the topic is like beauty or K-pop or, DIY, kind of, re-roof your house. I mean, it doesn't matter. And they're just like, yeah, they're such good people. We've become really close. I love them. They love me. We really get each other in this deep, authentic way, right? But as your fame grows and as you start to make more and more money from social media production, suddenly something switches in the relationship with your followers. Namely, that first, you can't keep track of all of them. So it becomes more of a faceless mass of people, right? And still a few of them from the beginnings, right? But most of them, they just become numbers. That's the first thing. And second, negative feedback starts coming in. Typically, you're going to get kind of hate comments, you're going to get death threats, you're going to get demeaning comments about your physical appearance or your mental health or whatever it is that, comes up in your videos. You're going to get stalkers, right, who show up kind of in your hometown and kind of perhaps show up at your doorstep. And suddenly you're just like, wait, like, wow, this is really taking a toll on me, because day after day, you get both the good parts of the internet and of that kind of public presence, but also the negative parts and the relentless like trolling, harassing, insulting, and everything that comes with it. And that takes such a heavy toll on the mental health of creators, that together with the pressure to publish all the time.
And from your point of view, the change in the algorithms, I'm seeing this on X all the time lately, that creators are complaining, hey, I was doing so well and they just changed the algorithm and now suddenly I'm getting shadow banned or whatever term they're using for it.
Yeah, so I have a whole thing about that. I mean, so basically creators talk about the algorithm kind of all the time. And it's really interesting because it's always the algorithm singular. It's not like all the computational procedures of social media platforms, of which there are many, right? Because you have feed algorithms, you have recommendation algorithms, you have demonetization algorithms. So these are basically algorithms that if your video is deemed to be not family friendly or edgy or being kind of a bit too close to kind of the edge of community guidelines in a range of ways, you're going to get demonetized, which means that you won't get any money from the ads getting served on the videos, right? So basically, for content creators, that means that they're not making money from that video, which is a big problem for them. And so that's like demonetization algorithms. And then you have content moderation algorithms that are, along the same lines, but with more serious sanctions, such as getting banned, for example, from a given platform, because your content goes against the community guidelines of the platform. All of these algorithms are kind of changing all the time. They are opaque. There is no announcement of what's happening, right? And so creators are always kind of like basically putting their finger in the air and trying to see what does the algorithm want at any given point in time, right? And trying to intuit what the algorithm is looking for. And so that's already kind of quite a thing there. But then what I kind of argue kind of in my book is that in a way, the algorithm becomes a shortcut for a more complex set of actors that, influencers and content creators prefer not to think too closely about. So one thing that content creators do is that they anthropomorphize the algorithm. So they keep on saying the algorithm is stupid. The algorithm is silly. The algorithm doesn't like me. Or the algorithm really likes them. They got really friendly and close with the algorithm, right? So all of these ways of projecting human characteristics onto computational procedures that are obviously, and to the best of our knowledge at this point, like not sentient, you know what I mean? They do not have emotions. But what I argue is that this kind of process of anthropomorphism is really because, so who is behind the algorithm? Social media companies, right? The Alphabet, the Meta, the TikToks of the world, right? ByteDance. Now, who else is behind the algorithm? The audience, right? I mean, basically, the algorithm just picking up on audience signals. And now, the algorithm, for creators, blaming the algorithm for everything that goes wrong is a way to avoid blaming social media companies, which very often are the one paying them through partner programs, right? And audiences, which also are the ones supporting them through their clicks and their engagement, right? So the algorithm is kind of a convenient scapegoat. And again, not to say that it's not unpredictable, opaque, and all of these things, but it's kind of a convenient kind of scapegoat for these broader kind of forces that really are responsible for the fortunes or lack of fortunes of content creators.
By the way, just from a neuroscience point of view, we always have to do this with systems that are sufficiently complex. We reduce them to a person because that's what we're evolved to do, is understand other people or try
exactly,
to. Yeah, exactly. So it's no surprise that people do that. I want to return to Ragebait for a moment because one of the things I've been so interested in, and this is on a lot of my podcasts, is about polarization and in-groups and out-groups and so on. And one thing that's hard not to notice is what I've been calling lately the fringe amplification effect, which is somebody on one side of the political spectrum makes a totally rage-baity video that's just so extreme in their political view on it. And then the other side says, look what the other side is doing, and they stitch in that video and everyone gets to see that. So the videos that, one side gets to see of the other is the most extreme.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a real problem because that's driving polarization.
But again, so I completely agree. I mean, I think so the way I kind of analyze this, that all of this stems from the economic incentives of content creators. And so again, we think a lot of it in terms of like political polarizations, right? And kind of deeply held beliefs, right? About politics or about religion or about immigration, you name it. But I guess I'm a bit more cynical, kind of in a way, and that's like the sociologist in me, where I'm like, sure, but that's also because platforms have put in place economic incentives that basically encourage content creators to produce this kind of polarizing content, again, because of like the logic of engagement. So if you want people to engage with your content, the tendency, and I've seen that in my interviews over and over and over again, creators start by saying, okay, I have one example. One of my case studies was vegan creators, okay? You'll tell me vegan creators, how nice, right? They're going to be talking about plant-based eating. It's good for the planet. It's good for the animals. It's good for your health, with kind of some precautions around it. So what could go wrong? How could that lead to polarization? Well, it turns out that, almost all the creators I talked about were like, well, okay, so there are a couple of really outrageous personalities that are extremely rage-baity within the vegan kind of influencer world, and that basically just like attack other creators and other kind of people for how they're doing veganism wrong. Right? So extremely kind of contentious, kind of like, you're doing it wrong. This is not the right way of being kind of a vegan. What they also see is like the rise of extremely restrictive diets that become more and more niche. So typically fruitivore diets where you only eat fruits, or raw vegan diets where you only eat raw fruits and veggies, or, things like that become like increasingly niche and kind of extreme, right? And what like all of my content creators were saying is that, and often, I will add, the creators that are the most kind of outrageous also start kind of verging into conspiracy theories, QAnon, at the time, Pizzagate. I mean, things where it's like, really blaming the system for everything that goes wrong and saying like, oh, you should live off-grid and be kind of on this extremely restrictive kind of vegan diet, and everything kind of going together, kind of. And what like my more moderate interviewees were saying is like, listen, what you realize is that as soon as I start covering or reacting or responding or stitching one of these more extreme influencers and what they say, my number of views and my watch time go way up. Because basically everybody wants to read that. It's like, oh, you're going to take down that outrageous influencer? Yes, please. Like, I'm going to watch it. And so what they were saying, my more moderate kind of, vegan creators, is that it's really a slippery slope towards more aggressive, more incendiary, more extreme kind of content. And even if you start kind of somewhere in the middle, after months and months of producing videos and seeing what performs well with the algorithm and audiences and kind of, social media platforms, you kind of go more towards polarized content. It's just kind of what the system is designed to kind of reward you for. And so, we've had social media now for 10 to 15 years, and what you see is this kind of war of all against all. But that's in part because of these economic incentives,
Let me ask you this. So in the world of, let's say, stand-up comedy, young comedians find that if they do a lot of cussing, that gets them a lot of attention. But then you have comedians like, let's say, Jerry Seinfeld, who never cussed and just kept slow and steady and did his thing without blue material and got really successful. Is there an equivalent in the algorithmic world?
So it's really interesting because that's a very good point, right? And I mean, I think that in general, you have this moderating force, a bit like my journalist at the time. You know what I mean? That even as some of them were going the road of clickbait, there was also a significant kind of pushback, saying this is not who we are, and this is not what we care about. And at the end of the day, I became a journalist for different reasons, not to cover X scandal, like in this kind of tabloid manner day after day. With influencers, what I do find, and it is kind of interesting because it's, slightly different, is that there is a moderating force, but it's not a neutral one. The moderating force is brands and sponsored content. So as an influencer, how do you make money? Either you do platform payments, right? And you receive money directly from Meta or YouTube or TikTok based on the number of views and the watch times that your videos get. Or the main way in which influencers make money is by contracting with brands to promote whatever the brand is doing and kind of promoting it in their videos, in their posts to their followers. Now, what's interesting about that, and for anyone who knows a bit about advertising, it's not that surprising, but brands hate polarization. They hate scandals because they want to appeal to the wider possible customer base that's out there, and they do not want to be associated with things that could raise red flags amongst their customers, or for that matter, amongst their boards or, financial stakeholders, right? And so what I find is that over time, you see two different profiles of content creators that emerge. You have the ones who really depend on virality, and they're going to go more and more extreme. It's really hard to fight against that. Again, there are some exceptions, but it's just really hard to fight against it because everything pushes you in that direction. It's like nudge after nudge after nudge. But you have a second category where they go mostly towards branded content, right? And for people who go more the route of sponsored content and working with brands, actually avoiding any whiff of, scandal, harassment, polarization, anything outrageous is really important because otherwise brands are going to stop working with them and they're going to lose revenues. So you do have these different poles there.
So is that enough of a force that we can have hope that we won't just sink completely into clickbait, ragebait world? Or are there things that social media companies can do / should do / might do someday that would change this?
This is an excellent question. So I think brands in themselves are not enough for two reasons. First, because, especially over the past year and a half, brands themselves have become politically polarized, right? So you have big companies taking sides on one side or the other. And especially, I'm thinking on the conservative side, the number of brands have aligned with, extremely misogynistic, anti-immigrant, and violent forms of content on social media and actually take pride in it because they're like, these are going to be our markets, right?
Like which brands? Give me an example.
Right now, I forget the name. I remember there is a coffee brand that's specifically marketed far right. And they're basically the more extreme, the better. This is where we want to advertise. This is the audience we want to get. And so they're finding a bit of a niche market there.
Presumably there's brands on the left. Ben and Jerry's, for
definitely,
example.
Obviously, like brands on the left too, or Costco, right? Also becoming more aligned with liberal attitudes in recent years. So, you do see that the transformations of politics, in part with social media, are also affecting brick and mortar companies, right? That themselves end up having to pick a side a bit more. So that's not so good, right? In terms of reducing polarization. If anything, it might be that this is the future we're moving towards. So that's the first thing.
It becomes part of your identity to drink this coffee or eat this ice cream.
Or go to that supermarket, right? Yeah. So that's kind of one way. So that's not perfect. The second thing with brands is that, again, brands hate politics in general, right? Most brands hate politics. And do we want content creators who either are incredibly incendiary and politicized or are not politicized at all? You know what I mean? You also probably want a healthy middle of people who are voicing kind of political questions and concerns and kind of hashing it out kind of on social media in a respectful and civic way. But this is not what brands want. Most brands, again, do not really want that. So it's not perfect. I think for me, thinking about what could be done, it's a complicated thing. And as often, social scientists are very good at kind of diagnosing what's going wrong, but less good at saying and this is what we should do now. But I am kind of mildly optimistic about subscription systems. I mean, I'm thinking of Substack, for example, where, a lot of content creators, a lot of writers have kind of gone solo, right? And gotten created newsletters on Substacks and monetizing that through kind of annual subscriptions. What I like about that is that these kinds of annual subscriptions do not create exactly the same kind of incentives as clickbait, right? Because you have your loyal audience and you want to keep on delivering quality content for them. Right? And so, again, it's a bit more like traditional newspapers and memberships. It's like you kind of have a sense of who your loyal audience is, and you're trying to do the best you can for them. And so I see that as one way in which the incentives are a bit different, but then it also raises lots of questions.
So I think it's a really good point about Substack, but not knowing the numbers off the top of my head, I have to imagine that Substack is so much smaller than, say, TikTok or Instagram. What do you see if you're thinking 5-10 years out about the future of this? Presumably short-form media is going to stay around, I think. People love the choice involved in it. Is anything going to change in some meaningful way?
So one of the big changes that has happened over the past 10 years, and which I think is going to continue, and it's a fascinating change because it's one that social media companies never talk about, is that average people have stopped sharing on social media. Normal, regular users, the bet that made Facebook successful, right? Which was you were going to connect with your friends and share pictures of you, whatever, going to the coffee shop or having kind of a moment or, going skiing. The average, the percentage of kind of overall content that comes from people who are not professional producers has gone from 80% to less than 5% over the past 10 years. It's something on which it's really hard to find data because social media companies do not publicize that because, again, part of their appeal is you may once in a while, you are going to see content from your friends, right? And that was the whole goal of social media platforms in the beginning, right? But this is not what you see on social media now. What you see is professionally produced content by kind of influencers and creators who make a living from their production.
It's like cable television where you have lots of production companies, lots of channels, and they've gotten quite good. I mean, the content is extraordinary. I wonder if they'll have to change the name social media at some point because it's not really that.
But that's exactly the point, right? So I think that if you look at the 10 years to come, right, you're going to see this decline of just friends content, organic, non-monetized content is going to keep on declining because, who wants to share a poorly shot picture of themselves when you have the Kardashians kind of next to you, or for that matter, all content producers who are doing high quality videos and posts, right? I mean, you don't really want to do that, and it doesn't feel like the space for it either. So then my question is are people going to stay on social media? Or, are the way in which they interact with social media going to be the same if it's all professional content producers 10 years from now? And I guess I do think that things are going to have to change when we get closer to exactly what you were talking about, which is more of a cable television system, except that you have 500 million channels, you know what I mean? Not 30.
And you have the option to swipe whenever.
And you have the option to swipe,
to
right? But I do think that for platforms, once that's kind of clarified and once people kind of understand that, we're not in the world that Facebook created circa 2000, 10, we're already in a world that's closer to cable television, where you get, like, again, this infinite kind of array of professional production on an infinite array of topics. I do think that things will get clearer, you know what I mean? Or that both the economic incentives, the algorithmic infrastructure, and the expectations of the audience are going to change. But I don't exactly know in which direction. So.
Yeah, we're really just in the adolescence of all these platforms.
This is so new.
And I'm really interested in what's happening with politics. I mean, it's clear that we're very polarized. Now, I do want to say, so you and I are both very interested in how algorithms play a role in that. I do want to say that people have always been polarized. And if you just look at, let's say, last century, 20th century, the polarization was so extreme that hundreds of millions of people were killed by their neighbors, whether that's Nazi Germany or the Chinese and Russian communist revolutions or Rwanda with the Tutsi against the Hutu or in Cambodia with Pol Pot, whatever. It doesn't matter. People always are very prone to get polarized. So I don't think it can be blamed on social media, but I am hopeful that if we sort of get out of our hormonal adolescence with these platforms, we can at least calm things down a little bit. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I mean, I think polarization, I think for the past 20 years, there has been, and predating social media, there has been this worry, right, that polarization is increasing. And I agree that historically, it's a bit of a myopic view, right, in the sense that, again, there is this very long history, and as you were saying, extremely deadly, of kind of people hating each other with such force that it led to actual civil war or kind of revolutions, etc. So that's kind of point number one. I agree also that social media is not the only culprit. There is no doubt about that. There are a number of other forces at stake, including big kind of macroeconomic and socio-demographic transformations in the United States, among other places, but in many countries that everybody's just kind of grappling with, right? And with the role of technology in society. And I also think that social media really doesn't help, right? In the sense of, like, again, it's not the only culprit, it's not the only cause, but it is enough to kind of tilt, the thing from a 3-4 to a 6-7, on the scale of 0 to 10. And what I find is that it's not only polarization, it's also this kind of like 24/7 newsrism, which, if you look at kind of the timeline of kind of news production, again, it's a longer history, right? In a way, it started with cable television, right? That were broadcasting 24/7, so it has a longer history, but certainly the reactivity of social media, the fact that you can post a video just right when it's happening, the fact that you can live stream, all of these developments just means that the rhythm of kind of news, kind of circulation and reaction to the reaction has just accelerated so much. Mm-hmm. And you see that it has definitely changed politics as well. I mean, political life used to be a pretty subdued kind of business. Like the rhythm, for example, of Congress is a very slow rhythm, as is the judicial rhythm. The time for the Supreme Court to make decisions a long time ago, that was taking like literally years, And now we're just like kind of in this, puff, 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 kind of every second there is a new kind of thing that is even more shocking than the previous one. And that, you can't help but kind of see that it is correlated with the affordances of social media platforms, right? And so the question then is, are we gonna move towards kind of a more stable kind of rhythm? Where, as you said, it's like, I think the parallel with adolescence is really interesting. That right now it's like everything's running really high. You know what I mean? Is everything gonna kind of calm down a bit? And I think that for that, we need to turn to kind of technology companies and just say, like, what are the incentives that you've created for people to post, right? And what are the guardrails that you're putting in place? And again, this is not to blame social media companies, because it's a really hard business. Like, hundreds of millions, billions of people are interacting with these algorithmic structures, right? And trying to kind of adjust things for that scale of kind of people, it's just incredibly hard. And so they are also on a learning curve, just like the rest of us are. So they're trying, in some cases, to do the right thing. In other cases, they're also making decisions that are kind of irresponsible, right? For example, getting rid of content moderation guidelines. I mean, you kind of know that that's going to encourage like much more kind of heinous, hateful behavior. Again, because that, not necessarily because creators believe in that heinous and hateful content, but because that's what's going to capture the engagement and attention of online audiences. And so I do think that social media platforms at this point are at a bit of a crossroad in terms of like, so you have become the key infrastructures for kind of media and communication. What are you going to do? Are you going to keep on chasing engagement at all costs, right? Potentially kind of destroying everything in your wake? Or are you going to start looking at the long-term satisfaction, the long-term kind of benefits, the long-term outview of what you can do for your customers? And I really think it's kind of a short-term, long-term kind of trade-offs that's happening right now. And I really hope that the long-term considerations are going to gain traction.
I love that. And I feel like social media companies don't necessarily have the economic incentive to do that unless one can stand out by saying, we're going to take less advertiser revenue for the purpose of making a better community here. And I think they could really stand out that way.
I agree. I mean, I think there are a couple of things that are pretty obvious. I mean, another one, and again, I mean, I know that it's not necessarily a popular recommendation, but we kind of got used to getting stuff for free. Audiences also have to change. We all have to change. And we kind of have to be willing to pay for access to social media platforms, because you see, if we all had kind of subscriptions, well, that would kind of reduce the part of advertising, right, in the kind of overall revenues of social media companies. So they wouldn't be chasing engagement metrics in quite the same way. So they wouldn't be putting quite the same incentives in place for content creators. And so everything would look a bit different. You know what I mean? So part of this is also due to the advertising only or advertising mostly revenue structures of social media companies. And I do think that all of us as customers, as audiences, as participants, we also have kind of a role to play in saying like, we should be willing to pay for this service. And again, so it raises lots of questions about access, democratization. There are lots of it. It's not an easy debate to have, but I think it's a debate worth having, because a lot of what's going wrong right now comes from this original, I don't want to call it an original sin, but this original deal, right, that advertising was going to be funding social media, period.
Yeah.
And that is not the healthiest way to kind of make a living as a company.
That was my conversation with Angele Cristin. And what we talked about today was this notion of algorithmic capture, which is the gradual reshaping of behavior in response to opaque systems that reward certain choices and ignore others. If you zoom out far enough, you can see that we are living inside a huge behavioral experiment. Billions of brains, billions of feedback loops, billions of tiny reinforcements happening every second. And in this environment, some headline performs well, or some video sparks outrage and multiplies. Maybe a creator feels the uplift of attention. Maybe a newsroom watches a dashboard climb or stall out. And gradually, everybody's behavior adapts. So as we heard from Angele, she studies journalists who entered the field with a sense of civic mission, or content creators who began with passion for a topic or a community. And by the way, this is just as true with lots of professions. Maybe a musician who enters wanting to create something really new, and then the metrics arrive, and suddenly they're dealing with the gravitational pull of the algorithm. I just want to zoom out for 1 second. As you'll know, if you've listened to a lot of these episodes, I'm always pointing out that polarization predates social media by millions of years. And obviously, any cursory reading of history will tell you that outrage predates the internet. Newspapers in the 19th century, for example, they ran inflammatory headlines. This was known as yellow journalism, and this all thrived long before Wi-Fi. Human attention has always been drawn to scandal and spectacle and celebrity. But the scale of the quantification of today's systems do introduce a new texture to public life. Everything accelerates, the incentives intensify, and presumably the emotional temperature rises. But I do want to say, as a techno-optimist, that nothing here is inevitable. Incentives can be redesigned. Revenue models can and will evolve. Platforms can make different trade-offs. Audiences can decide what they're willing to pay for, and creators can choose which signals they respond to. None of this is simple, but it is important to realize that we are in the earliest chapters of a story about how human psychology interfaces with computational systems. We are in the infancy phase of a technology that now functions as infrastructure. So the next time you feel outrage when you're scrolling around, or you see a headline that's engineered to hook you, or you watch numbers tick upwards somewhere on a screen, just pause for a second to ask yourself, what behavior of mine is getting reinforced? What is being trained? How do I want to participate in the system a little more thoughtfully? Understanding the machinery just gives you a little more agency inside of it. And that might be one of the most important skills for living in this second quarter of the 21st century. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Join the weekly discussions on my Substack, and check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.